Lincoln is the most written about American. He's only behind Napoleon and Jesus Christ in terms of biographies of people ever written. And we're just beginning the bicentennial, so I suspect Napoleon is in trouble for number 2. And I get asked this question a lot. Why do we need another biography of Lincoln? Why? That's okay. But it's also about the fate of African Americans in this nation. And I think that's why we're so fascinated with it. You can expand that to mean, I think, how people who are perceived as different fit into a republic or democracy.
Thoughts on Lincoln? First off, it's free is the state of mind. It's not what any person can do with a little pen on a piece of paper.
In reality, the Emancipation Proclamation meant very little or nothing. I mean, it didn't, the Southerners just ignored it, and there weren't a lot of slaves in the North to set free, as in none. So, I mean, it was a symbolic gesture, and I think as a symbolic gesture, I think as a statement that maybe affected the direction of the war, or as a statement of confidence by the North or the Union that they felt they were in a position where they could then proceed to win the war. I mean, I think it was very meaningful that way. But I think as it directly affected slaves, I don't think it accomplished much. I think it was the constitutional amendment that came later that obviously made all the difference.
But what Abraham Lincoln did in the Proclamation is cute. If I go to any drugstore and buy an almanac and read the Emancipation Proclamation, what he did in the Emancipation Proclamation, he freed black people where he couldn't free them. And he left them in slavery where he could have freed them. Quickly, at 2 towns, 2 cities in Virginia. This is perfect for Virginia. Yes, Norfolk and Richmond. On January the 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln couldn't get a cup of coffee in Richmond, Virginia. In Norfolk, Virginia, on January the 1st, 1863, he controlled every nail, every plank, every gun, every ship. You know what he did? On January the 1st, 1863, he freed all the slaves in Richmond, where he had absolutely no power. And he left all the slaves in Norfolk, Virginia, in slavery. They don't teach that in Virginia, but that's the story of the real emancipator.
So if you think of emancipation as one place on a continuum of freedoms, then it makes more sense because it shows how important a meaningful vote becomes as central to freedoms. One scholar found that there were 200 definitions of freedom in 1860. So freedom is a very different thing for an enslaved person on a Louisiana plantation versus the person who considered themselves the owner of that person, or a young woman sewing at 14 years of age, sewing soles on shoes in a shoe factory.
I don't think that was free at all. And so my grandma just passed away. She was a sharecropper. It killed her body. That was slavery. I mean, that was slavery right there. She told me they used to make this much, and they was working to keep this much. But over the year, they would starve so much they had to borrow this much, and then they was always in a negative sense. So the next year, they had to make this much. I was like, and conditions were still the same. People still got hurt, beat, raped, and everything. That's not free to me. I mean, shit.
Would have never allowed people to take advantage of others as they did in the South, taking away the vote or the whole sort of sharecropping systems to work out as it did.
144 years after Lincoln. But let's talk about Lincoln as it relates to when slavery, so-called free. Lincoln sold the African out after the African won the Civil War. Lincoln was laying us to Jim Crow in. So Lincoln's legacy should be Jim Crow. And the way he created Jim Crow is because he allowed those Confederate states to take back power after they had supposedly became part of the Union, but had lost their numbers in terms of being able to elect an official. He took the rights from blacks by giving those former slave owners better rights than the people who had fought for the freedom of the so-called pro quo. I think about my great-grandfather, who in 1967 passed away. I remember him telling stories. Him and my great uncle was 103 in 67. About how the reason they made them leave the South was because they were locking black people up, which is a new form of slavery. Today the penitentiary is nothing but the slave institution sanctioned by our government. 1 million Africans are enslaved present in America. They call it prison, but hey, we know what that's all about. All our rights, we still got no rights to this day. To this day, we have a youth population that has more felonies.
You know, they used us. Or this country owes us something. We've forgotten that St. Augustine, Florida, in the 1580s was built by people of African descent. We've forgotten that the United States Capitol was built by people of African descent. Thomas Jefferson did not build Monticello. The Hemings and other black craftsmen built it. And we hang our heads in shame.
Lincoln was unusual because he didn't curse. He never used God's name in vain, seldom cursed. He didn't smoke, he didn't drink, and he didn't even use firearms or hunt as a grown man here on the frontier. Because Lincoln comes to see that God, he believes, has something for him to do. And he's working out God's will. He's not even sure what it is, but it gives him that sense of esteem that he is doing God's will. And Lincoln,
I don't agree with what what had happened during that time, but he just did what he thought he had to do because he had his own personal issues going on in his own household.
Lincoln's whole life was based on two things. One was equality of opportunity, always essential, but based upon rule of law, which makes him conservative. But he did not think society, particularly as I said, the book's about liberty and freedom. You can't have liberty and freedom. You get so close to anarchy unless you follow the law. And so he felt bound by the Constitution. He did not have the right. In fact, people thought the Emancipation Proclamation that he did do was illegal. He was also worried that if he freed all, that would mean the border states, Maryland and particularly Kentucky, would immediately, he'd already been trying to get them to free their slaves, offering compensation and everything. Lincoln understands this. So when he understands that, I think he has that sense of esteem and need. So religion is tied into who he is and his relationship with God. It's beyond belief to me that people can read what Lincoln is saying and not see the sense of religion and faith that he has in God.
Why compensate slaveholders when their wealth was based on the unpaid labor of those who were promised emancipation?
You pay them would save just the days of what war cost. You look at what war costs today in our federal, he's showing this to people, say this would be so much cheaper than a single life dying, let alone the cost of the war. So that is what he is trying to do. And that's why he pushes so much for the 13th Amendment. I mean, because he knows that people might even go back and say the Emancipation Proclamation is not legal. You could argue it's a wartime measure. And there is no doubt in my mind that Lincoln was preparing America for, in fact, black citizenship, just as he had for emancipation. My friend Lerone Bennett, who I have so much respect for, uses the Emancipation Proclamation and Lincoln's letter in response to Horace Greeley's A Prayer of 40 Million, in which he says, if I could free some of the people and not others, I would do it. If I could free them all to win the war, I would do it. Free none of them, I would do it, and to win this war. But they usually don't go on to show the rest of that quote, which was, of course, that is because, I'm president, I'm bound by the kind, never to say that my own personal view has always been that all men everywhere should always be free and that I'm against slavery.
People don't know that Abraham Lincoln did not free the slaves, never intended to free the slaves. And most people don't know that Abraham Lincoln was opposed to black people voting, holding office, intermarrying with white people in the state of Illinois and in the United States of America. Finally, the great irony of this is that the only liberation plan Abraham Lincoln had was the constitutional amendment to deport the black people of this country.
He never advocated deportation. He always said only those who wanted to.